4 years ago, on Christmas night, my family and I were driving back from a fancy restaurant where we'd spent the evening celebrating. I was still wide awake, unlike my parents and younger siblings, who looked ready to pass out from too much food and holiday excitement. The 45-minute drive home felt endless to me. As if that wasn't enough, my little sister was whining non-stop about how her friend didn't get her anything for Christmas. The kind of complaint that would normally make me roll my eyes. But that night, something about it felt different. Maybe even a little ominous. About 20 minutes into the drive, my dad pulled into a gas station to pick up cigarettes, and my mom and younger siblings decided to hop out for a bathroom break. I stayed in the car. I'd already gone before we left the restaurant, and I had a new game I'd downloaded that I was eager to try out. After a few rounds on my phone, I glanced up at the car clock. 10 minutes had passed, which seemed like a long time for everyone to still be gone. I figured maybe they'd gotten held up in a line, or Dad was caught in a chat with the cashier. But the longer I sat there alone, the more I started to feel the weight of the darkness outside pressing against the windows. That's when I felt it. A strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I glanced out the window and froze. There was a man standing under the dim lights by the pumps, staring straight at our car. His face was expressionless, blank in a way that made it hard to tell what he was thinking. The darkness around him seemed to eat up the details, so I couldn't see him well. He looked to be about average height, maybe around 5'9", with an odd, almost stiff posture that seemed completely unnatural. He must have been middle-aged, but that's about all I could tell from my vantage point in the car. When he realized I'd noticed him, he took a step closer. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. Something about him felt deeply wrong. Just then, my dad and the rest of the family returned, piling into the car as my dad apologized, explaining he'd had some argument with the cashier. I barely heard him. My attention was glued to the man outside, who was now glaring at us with a look of clear annoyance. I exhaled with relief as we pulled away, leaving him in the rearview mirror. But even as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. I told myself I was overreacting and tried to push the thought of him away. But as we got closer to home, the unsettling image of his blank face kept flashing through my mind. Later that night, when everyone else was asleep, I lay in bed watching YouTube, with a storm raging outside. I've always loved storms. The sound of rain and thunder usually made me feel safe and cozy, like the world outside couldn't touch me. But that night, the storm only added to my sense of unease. Eventually, I set my phone aside, letting the sound of the rain fill the room as I closed my eyes and tried to relax. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud against the window behind me. I jolted forward, my heart racing. For a second, I thought maybe a bird had flown into the glass. But when I parted the blinds to take a look, my heart stopped. There, standing by our cars in the driveway, was the same man from the gas station. He was drenched from the rain, but that didn't seem to bother him. He was looking up at my bedroom window, his gaze fixed directly on me. When he realized I was watching, he smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that sent a chill through me. The blankness of his face twisted into something sinister in that smile. I backed away from the window, a scream building in my throat. I finally let it out and within seconds, my dad burst into the room, his face twisted in panic and confusion. "What's going on?" he demanded. I tried to explain, my voice shaking as I told him about the man from the gas station and how he was now outside our house. Dad's expression hardened. He grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet and told me to call the police. As I fumbled with my phone, my eyes kept darting back to the window, half expecting the man to appear there, watching. Within minutes, the police arrived. I heard the muffled sound of their car pulling up, and blue and red lights flashed through the windows. It felt like an eternity before they came to the door to let us know they'd found the man hiding in our shed. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a sense of dread. What had he been planning? Why had he followed us? The officers loaded him into their car, and as they drove away, I caught a final glimpse of him, staring back at our house with that same chilling smile. The next day, my dad and I inspected the property, trying to make sense of what had happened. When we checked the back door, our stomachs turned. The handle was damaged, scratched and twisted, as though someone had tried to break in. He'd been closer to getting inside than we'd realized, and I couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if he'd succeeded. To this day, I can't go to a gas station alone without feeling a prickle of fear, and I often find myself double-checking the locks at night, haunted by the thought of that blank, grinning face. It was Christmas Eve during my freshman year of high school. My family had been split up for a while, so we rotated spending Christmas Day and Christmas Eve together. This year, I had come home early from my grandparents' Christmas party, while everyone else was still celebrating at my aunt and uncle's house. Since it was a rarity to have the whole place to myself, I turned down my cousin's offer to stay with me for a few hours. I wanted to watch some new DVDs I'd gotten as gifts and enjoy some peaceful, undisturbed time at home. As I got out of the car, I noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked along the street. It didn't look out of place, just an average sedan parked by the curb. I figured it belonged to one of the neighbor's relatives who'd come over for the holiday. Our neighborhood was quiet, especially on a cold winter night like this. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and I didn't give it much thought. Once inside, I locked the door, grabbed some snacks, and nestled down in the living room, trying to enjoy the rare tranquility. With the house quiet and everyone else away, I planned to watch a couple of movies without anyone interrupting. I had barely settled in when a sudden knock on the door shattered the silence. A little startled, I hesitated for a moment, then got up to answer it. Unlocking the door and opening it just a crack, I found a man standing on the doorstep. He looked like an average guy, dark hair, glasses, dressed in a casual jacket and jeans. Yet, something about him set off a strange feeling in my gut. He had this blank expression, his eyes barely meeting mine. "I was wondering about the car outside," he said, glancing past me toward the driveway. "Is it for sale?" A little taken aback, I stammered, I don't think so." He shifted his weight slightly, looking over my shoulder into the house, as if trying to see if anyone else was home. "Is there someone here I can talk to about it?" he asked, his voice low and unsettlingly calm. Nervously, I said, "No, sorry, you can come back another time." Quickly, I shut the door, my heart pounding. As soon as it clicked shut, I locked it, not even caring if it seemed rude. For a second, I stood frozen. waiting to see if he would walk away. But then, to my horror, the door handle jiggled. He was trying to open it. Then came a loud pounding. First one fist, then the other. The sound echoed through the house, each pound louder than the last. My heart was racing. What did this man want? I tried to tell myself that maybe he was just frustrated, but something deep inside me knew that he wasn't here to buy a car. Trying to stay as quiet as possible, I dropped to my knees and crawled away from the door, hoping he wouldn't see me through any of the windows. I reached for the phone, trying to keep my breathing under control. Just as my hand wrapped around the receiver, I remembered the open garage door. My stomach sank as I thought about the door leading from the garage to the laundry room, a door with a broken lock that no one had bothered to fix. A chill ran down my spine as I heard the distinct creak of the garage door opening, followed by footsteps. He was in the garage. I knew if he went through the laundry room door, he'd be inside the house in seconds. Panic surged through me, and I desperately looked for anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a heavy metal paperweight on the coffee table, and I grabbed it, clutching it tightly in my hand. The footsteps grew louder, echoing against the cement floor of the garage. I was about to crawl toward the kitchen to grab a knife when I heard a loud, angry shout outside. Through the living room window, I could see another figure running toward the garage. My uncle. He must have decided to come home early after all. Relief flooded me as I watched him storm into the garage, yelling at the man. The stranger didn't wait. He bolted out of the garage and sprinted down the street, vanishing into the darkness. My uncle chased him briefly, but stopped after a few steps, then turned and headed toward the house, his face a mix of confusion and anger. Once inside, he saw me crouched on the floor, gripping the paperweight, my face pale with terror. I could barely get the words out as I explained what had happened. He sat down beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders to calm me, but I could see the worry etched on his face. I think he was as shaken as I was, though he tried to hide it. I stayed glued to my uncle's side until the rest of the family got home. We called the police, but without a plate number or any identifying details beyond his vague description, there wasn't much they could do. An officer took our statements and did a quick patrol of the area, but the man was long gone. The next day, we inspected the house, checking for any signs of forced entry. When we reached the back door, a small detail caught my eye. The handle was damaged, as if someone had tried to force it open but hadn't succeeded. That simple sight sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. This man hadn't just been knocking to ask about a car. He'd been trying to get inside. I shudder to think what might have happened if my uncle hadn't come home when he did, or if the man had managed to get through the broken lock in the garage. Even now, I often replay that night in my mind, thinking about how close I came to being alone with a stranger who'd clearly had something darker in mind. To this day, I refuse to stay home alone on Christmas Eve, or any holiday for that matter. This happened over 20 years ago. It was Christmas Eve, and I was driving home with my girlfriend at the time. My mother's family used to hold a big holiday gathering at my aunt's house in Estacada. This was my girlfriend's first time meeting my extended family, and I was nervous about how it would go. But she fit right in. All evening, we enjoyed the warmth and cheer of the celebration, laughing, talking, and playing poker, while passing around the usual assortment of holiday cocktails. By the time we were ready to leave, my girlfriend was a little too inebriated to drive, so I took the wheel. It was around 11 p.m. or so, and I was driving her old car along Highway 211. Now, this stretch of road is fairly remote, bordered by farmland and dense, dark forest. A good portion of it is unlit, and that night, with only the headlights to light our way, the road seemed even darker than usual. I wasn't fazed, though. I grew up around here and knew this road like the back of my hand. We were both in good spirits, our conversation light and easy, enjoying the sense of being in our own little world together as we drove through the quiet countryside. It was one of those rare moments that felt like it would stay with you forever. There's a stretch of Highway 211 that dips down a steep hill before crossing Deep Creek. On both sides of this part of the highway, thick forest lines the road, closing in like a dark tunnel. There are no lights in this area. The only thing visible was what the car's high beams could reach. As I drove down the hill, crossed the bridge over Deep Creek, and climbed back up, I suddenly saw movement in the road ahead. Out of nowhere, something darted across our path, so close that I almost hit it. I slammed on the brakes, and we jolted forward in our seats. My girlfriend gasped, and I turned to her, asking if she saw what I just saw. She nodded, eyes wide, but she couldn't tell what it was either. It could have been a coyote. They're common in this area. But something about this didn't feel right. Coyotes don't usually dart out in front of cars like that, especially so close. I felt an odd sense of unease, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. Still, I shrugged it off and kept driving, but something gnawed at me, an urge to figure out what I'd seen. So, in a moment of strange curiosity, I turned the car around, flipping on the high beams to better illuminate the spot where it had disappeared into the woods. Against my girlfriend's quiet protests, I stopped the car, got out, and walked a few steps toward the forest. The air was silent, the kind of shin-biting silence that settles in the dead of winter. I looked around, squinting to see if anything moved among the shadows, but saw nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there, watching me. My heartbeat quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled with tension. Just then, the blaring sound of the car horn shattered the silence, nearly making me jump out of my skin. But it wasn't a simple beep beep, like my girlfriend might have done if she was playfully urging me back. It was a continuous, deafening beep, lasting several long seconds. Confused, I turned around and hurried back to the car, glancing around as I walked, my instincts on high alert. I opened the driver's door and asked her, "Why'd you lean on the horn like that?" She didn't respond right away. She just looked at me, wide-eyed, her face pale. Then she raised a shaking hand and pointed to a spot about 50 feet away, just at the edge of the forest, where the light from the high beams faded into darkness. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw him. There, standing still as a statue, was a man. He was completely naked, his pale skin smeared with dirt and mud, making him blend almost ghost-like with the shadows. In his right hand, he held something that glinted faintly in the headlights. A hatchet. For a moment, he just stood there, staring back at us with a blank, almost detached expression. Then, as if realizing he'd been seen, he tilted his head slightly, gave us a slow, unsettling smile, and raised his free hand in a lazy wave, as though he were greeting old friends. Without another glance, he turned and slipped back into the shadows, vanishing into the dense forest. A jolt of terror surged through me, and I scrambled back into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it in one swift motion. My girlfriend and I stared at each other for a heartbeat before I slammed my foot on the gas and sped away, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see him somehow chasing us down the road. Once we were safely back on the main stretch of the highway, my girlfriend finally found her voice. She explained, her words shaky, what had just happened. While I'd been out of the car, searching in the opposite direction, she'd caught a movement out of the corner of her eye. She saw the man emerge from another part of the forest, closer to the car, almost hidden in the darkness beyond the headlights. She watched, horrified, as he crept silently toward me, his hatchet raised, his eyes fixed on my back as though he was preparing to strike. That was when she'd leaned on the horn, hoping to warn me and scare him off. When we made it back home, we immediately called the police. An officer came to take our statements, but without a clear description and no solid leads, there wasn't much they could do. We never heard any more about the incident, and the authorities never mentioned finding anyone in the area. The officer who interviewed us suggested that maybe the man was targeting unsuspecting travelers for reasons we could only imagine. He even said, rather bluntly, that my girlfriend's quick thinking had likely saved my life. That horn blast let the man know that I wasn't alone out there. I moved back to the area recently, and I often find myself driving that same stretch of highway. I haven't seen any sign of the naked hatchet man since, but every time I pass Deep Creek, I feel that same chill creep over me. I keep my eyes trained on the roadside, always a little more vigilant, as if expecting to see a figure emerge from the shadows. After all, if it happened once, who's to say it couldn't happen again? This happened in 2019, when I was in my second year of college, living in a townhome about a 10-minute walk from campus. I had 2 roommates, but they were both back at their parents' homes for the holidays. I was working in healthcare at the time, and had to stay in town to work through Christmas. Here's some backstory to set the scene. We used to have a 4th roommate, but she moved out after some serious issues with her boyfriend. He was a nightmare, constantly overstepping boundaries and practically living with us despite only being allowed to visit occasionally. Things escalated one night when he got physical with her and verbally abusive with the rest of us. We told her he had to go, and when she refused, we warned that we'd have to involve the landlord. She ended up moving out on bad terms with all of us. For context, I've been in an abusive relationship before, so I truly understood the position she was in. I spent 2 years trying to help her see what was happening, but at that point, it was affecting everyone, and we no longer felt safe with him around. She made her choice and left. Fast forward to Christmas Eve. I had to work the next day, so I locked the doors, turned off all the lights, and headed to my bedroom downstairs to wind down. I spent about an hour scrolling through TikTok when I heard something above me. The distinct sound of chairs being moved in the kitchen, which was directly over my bedroom. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe it was the neighbors next door. Our townhome shared walls, and they could be pretty loud sometimes. But then I remembered they weren't home. They'd texted me earlier, asking if I could grab a package for them while they were away. That realization made my stomach drop. The noise stopped quickly, so I convinced myself it was nothing and tried to relax. But then my bedroom door creaked open. In that moment, I froze, A flashback of my second-grade teacher telling us about her house being broken into hit me. She said she'd pretended to be asleep to avoid drawing attention, hoping the intruder would just take what they wanted and leave. I wanted to do the same, but my damn phone screen was glowing, lighting up my terrified, wide-eyed face. I couldn't even fake being asleep. I was lying there, staring at the door, while a man I didn't recognize stood halfway in my room. The door was cracked open, and we locked eyes. I couldn't make out much, just the silhouette of a man wearing a backward baseball cap. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. It felt like an eternity, but it must have only been about 10 seconds. Slowly, he stepped back, pulled the door closed, and disappeared. I sat there, paralyzed in shock. My mind raced. I knew I needed to call the police, but anxiety took over. If I called, it would notify my parents, and I didn't want to scare them. What if the intruder was still in the house and heard me? What would he do? Instead, I texted the guy I was seeing at the time. Some random guy just broke into my house and came into my room. His response snapped me out of my panic. "Call the police, now." So I did. The dispatcher asked if I felt safe enough to go upstairs and unlock the front door for the officers so they wouldn't have to break it down. My answer was a firm no. I didn't care if the door was broken. I wasn't about to leave my room and risk running into whoever was still in the house. A couple of minutes later, I saw flashlights shining through my window. Relief flooded me as I heard the police knocking on the front door, announcing themselves. They made their way inside and asked me where I was. I cautiously stepped out of my room, and an officer came to escort me upstairs. They told me to wait on the back porch while 2 officers searched the house, guns drawn, while another stayed with me. It felt like a scene straight out of a movie. They moved cautiously, turning corners with their weapons at the ready, checking every room and closet. But after what felt like forever, they told me the house was clear. No one was there. Even stranger, nothing appeared to be stolen. They tried dusting for fingerprints, but came up empty. Then the question started. They informed me that the back door had been unlocked with no signs of forced entry. My stomach sank. I was sure I'd locked it before going to bed. That night, the guy I'd been talking to stayed over to keep me company, but I still couldn't sleep. My mind raced with what-ifs, and I compulsively checked every inch of the house over and over again. I wedged chairs under the door handles on the front door, back door, and my bedroom, desperate to feel even a shred of security. The next day, I told our landlord about what had happened and asked for the locks to be changed. To my shock, she flat out refused to come out or send anyone to do it. For the rest of the time we lived there, the locks were never changed. That experience has stuck with me. To this day, I triple-check every single door before going to bed, no matter where I am. I've since gotten a dog who helps with my anxiety about intruders, and I recently invested in a Ring doorbell for added peace of mind. I can't shake the feeling that it was our old roommate's boyfriend. I wouldn't be surprised if they'd made him an extra key when he was staying there. But if it was him, why didn't he take anything? Why didn't he harm me or the house? And if it wasn't him, and it was someone random, why didn't they follow through on whatever they'd planned? It's a mystery that still haunts me. This happened about 4 years ago, when I was around 8 months pregnant. Very visibly so. I'm not a writer, so bear with me as I do my best to recount what happened. It was close to Christmas, and I had been doing some late-night shopping at the local mall. It was around 9 p.m. when I finally finished up and headed out to my truck. At this particular mall, the parking lot is separated from the building by a small road that loops around the entire complex. To get to your vehicle, you have to cross the road, making the walk back to the car feel a little more exposed, especially at night. As I left the store and started toward my truck, I noticed a man standing in the middle of the road. Our eyes met briefly, and I quickly looked away, not wanting to engage. Something about him put me on edge. At the same time, 2 other men passed by him on their way into the mall. He didn't say a word to them, or even glance in their direction. His focus stayed on me. I tried to shake off the unease and kept walking, but I noticed him start to move. He was following me. Then, I heard him call out, "Excuse me, can you help me?" Being Southern has its drawbacks, one of them being the near-reflexive urge to be polite, even in situations where you shouldn't be. Against my better judgment, I paused and asked cautiously, "What do you need?" He looked around, almost nervously, and said, "Could you help me start my car? I think my battery's dead." Now let me set the scene. I'm very visibly pregnant, walking alone in a dimly lit parking lot. Just moments ago, 2 perfectly capable men had walked right past him, and yet he hadn't asked them for help. Why would he approach me? Someone clearly not in a position to assist. My instincts screamed that this didn't add up. It was time to go. "Sorry, I can't help," I said firmly, picking up my pace toward my truck. But he wasn't giving up. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him following me. My hand gripped my keys tightly as I hurried toward the safety of my vehicle. My heart raced as he called out again, his tone more insistent this time. "You're really not going to help me? I just need a jump." "Nope. Sorry," I shot back, my voice steady, despite the growing fear bubbling inside me. I kept moving, trying not to look back. All I wanted was to get to my truck, lock the doors, and get out of there. Here's the continuation of your story, keeping the suspense and emotional tension intact. I finally made it to my truck, unlocked it, and jumped inside. My hands were shaking, but I managed to lock the doors just as I saw him start running toward me. Fumbling with my keys, I tried desperately to get them into the ignition, but my hands were trembling so much that it felt impossible. Panic set in as he reached the truck, slamming his hand against my window. "I just need your help for a minute," he shouted, his voice muffled but forceful. My fear boiled over into anger. "No! Get the hell away from me!" I screamed back, my voice cracking. Instead of backing off, he grabbed the door handle and began yanking on it, his face contorted in frustration. "Just open the door!" he yelled, his voice growing more aggressive. That's when something inside me snapped. My instincts shifted from fear to survival. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was protecting my unborn child. In one swift motion, I reached into the console and grabbed my .38 Special. I had my concealed carry license for exactly this kind of situation, and though I had hoped I'd never need to use it, I knew I was prepared. I rolled the window down just enough, aimed the barrel directly at his face, and shouted, "I'm not going to tell you again. Get the fuck away from me." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. He stood there, his expression shifting from shock to realization. He didn't say a word, didn't argue, didn't move toward me. He just turned and ran. I sat there, frozen, my hands still gripping the gun. I couldn't move. My mind raced with what could have happened, what he might have done if I hadn't trusted my instincts. The fear of the unknown was almost as overwhelming as the reality I had just faced. Eventually, I managed to put the gun back in the console and start the truck, though I didn't drive away right away. I just sat there, shaking and trying to process what had happened. The terror of what he might have done, and the fact that I'd had to threaten someone's life, hit me all at once. It's a moment I'll never forget. I hope I'm never in that kind of situation again, but if I am, I know one thing for sure. I'll be ready. Christmas Eve dinner at Burger King. Definitely not how I'd imagined spending the evening. But after working late and realizing my options were limited, it seemed like the best choice. I finished work around 9, had some coupons for BK, and figured it would be a quick and easy stop. When I arrived, I noticed the restaurant was still open, but the dining room was closed. The only way to order was through the drive-thru. The problem? I didn't have a car. Undeterred, I tried walking up to the drive-thru window to place my order, but the young woman working there wouldn't have it. She told me in no uncertain terms that without a vehicle, I couldn't use the drive-thru. Her lack of flexibility annoyed me, and I'll admit I said a few things I'm not exactly proud of. That's when she appeared. An older woman, probably in her mid-50s, stepped into the scene like a Christmas miracle. She offered to let me jump in her car so I could order my food. At first, I declined. I didn't want to be a bother, but she was persistent, kindly insisting until I reluctantly agreed. We got in her car, and I placed my order. Unfortunately, the wait for the food was long. So long that I missed my bus home. I couldn't hide my frustration, and the woman, noticing my disappointment, surprised me by offering to give me a ride. I hesitated. Something about the offer felt off, but she was persistent, in the nicest way possible, and eventually convinced me. After all, I'm a 250-pound, 30-something guy. I figured I didn't have much to fear from a woman in her 50s. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have accepted a ride, but I told myself it was fine and got in the car. As we drove, I directed her toward my neighborhood. Things seemed normal at first, but about 5 minutes from my house, she made a wrong turn. Politely, I explained that we needed to head the other way. I even suggested she could just let me out, and I'd walk the rest of the way. That's when everything changed. Her demeanor shifted, the kind smile fading into something sterner, almost unsettling. "I can't let you spend Christmas Eve alone," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "You're coming to my house." I froze, my unease growing with every word she spoke. Trying to stay calm, I explained that I needed to get home immediately. My dog was waiting, and he needed to be let out. But she didn't budge. "I'll take care of you," she said, her tone firm and almost possessive. I started to realize this ride might not be as harmless as I had thought. As we continued driving, her tone shifted further. She tried to entice me by mentioning cocaine and liquor at her place, as if that might change my mind. But since I'm in recovery, I told her firmly I wasn't interested. That's when things took an even darker turn. She refused to stop, turn around, or let me out of the car. Her driving became erratic, blowing through stop signs as if she didn't care about the rules of the road. My heart was racing, my mind scrambling to figure out my next move. I kept thinking about what might be waiting for me at her house, if we ever got there. I knew I could physically overpower her if it came to that, but what if someone else was waiting for me? I felt a pang of guilt, too. She had been kind earlier, helping me order food, and now the idea of hurting her felt wrong. But the kindness had turned into something twisted, and I couldn't ignore the growing danger. I knew I had to act before it was too late. The problem was, I had no idea where her house was or how much time I had left. Then, I saw my chance. The car in front of us stopped at a stop sign, and another vehicle was paused across the intersection. Her car slowed to almost a complete stop, and in that split second, I made my decision. I jumped. The car was still moving as I flung the door open and bolted out, leaving my food behind. I hit the ground running, adrenaline surging through me as I sprinted away. Behind me, I heard her stop and get out of her car. She called after me, trying to coax me back. Her voice was calm and insistent, as if none of this was strange. But getting back into that car wasn't an option. I didn't stop running until I was sure I wasn't being followed. When I finally made it home, I locked the door behind me and checked every window to make sure she hadn't come after me. My mind raced with the possibilities of what could have happened if I hadn't escaped. What if I hadn't been in recovery? 2 years earlier, her offer of drugs and alcohol might have worked. I might have willingly gone with her, and who knows what could have happened. Kidnapping, murder, trafficking, organ trade. The possibilities were chilling. As a man, I'd never truly understood the vulnerability most women feel every day. But that night changed everything. It made me realize how easily someone with bad intentions could exploit kindness and opportunity. I can't say for certain what her motives were. Maybe she was just an overly pushy stranger with poor judgment, or maybe it was something far more sinister. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. Looking back, I've debated whether I should have gone to the police. Would they have believed me? Or would they have dismissed my fear because I'm a man? I'll never know if my decision not to report it put someone else in danger. That thought weighs on me. This happened about 5 years ago when I was 9 months pregnant. It was a Saturday night, and I was Christmas shopping at the mall with my 2 daughters. One was 7, and the other was 15. We live in a super safe city with a low crime rate, so I didn't think twice about being out late. There was an Applebee's connected to the mall, and since we were finishing our shopping close to closing time, I decided to take the girls there for a late dinner. By the time we were done, it was around 10 p.m., and we walked out through the Applebee's entrance into a nearly deserted parking lot, loaded down with shopping bags. As we got to the car, I was fumbling with the bags on my arms, trying to dig out my car keys, when I noticed a man, probably in his 50s, walking toward us from somewhere in the parking lot. He had shaggy gray and white hair, a faded flannel shirt, and worn-out jeans. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then he got closer, maybe 40 feet away, and suddenly said, "This is a stick-up. Give me all your money." I froze. My blood ran cold, and I stared at him in disbelief. What?" I stammered, my voice shaking. Then, as casually as you can imagine, he said, "Just kidding." But he didn't stop there. He came right up to my car and stood next to my daughters, who were waiting on the other side of the car for me to unlock the doors. At this point, I'm trying to stay calm, but my brain is screaming, "This is not okay." He starts making small talk with me and my kids, asking questions like whether they were being good for Santa, how old they were, if we got all our Christmas shopping done, and what we'd bought. He seemed totally coherent, not drunk, high, or mentally unstable. Just a perfectly sound and creepy adult. Now picture this. I'm a very pregnant woman, alone in a mostly empty parking lot at 10 p.m., with 2 kids and shopping bags, and this random guy is casually chatting us up. He's standing right next to my kids, and I'm on the opposite side of the car, trying to act calm while frantically digging in my purse for my car keys. He's talking away, and I'm trying to politely keep the situation from escalating. My hands are shaking as I search for my keys in what feels like a bottomless pit of a purse. Meanwhile, he keeps glancing over his shoulder, which only adds to my unease. I'm doing my best to stay composed, but inside, I'm panicking. I had this gut feeling that at any moment, he could pull out a weapon, and my kids were right there, separated from me. My older daughter, the 15-year-old, was clearly getting uncomfortable. She kept glancing at me, trying to gauge my reaction. Kids tend to assume everything's fine if their parents seem calm. And since he was just talking, and I wasn't freaking out, on the outside at least, they didn't pick up on how dangerous this situation felt. I was 9 months pregnant, and no match for a grown man, especially if he was hiding a weapon. I tried everything to subtly end the conversation. I smiled politely and said things like, "It was nice chatting, but we've got to get going. Time to get the kids to bed." I even prompted my daughters to say goodbye, but he wasn't taking the hint. He kept sidestepping my attempts to wrap things up, asking the girls questions about their favorite school subjects and telling them what lovely young ladies they were. Meanwhile, my 7-year-old, who is naturally outgoing, was completely oblivious to how not okay this situation was. To her, he was just a friendly stranger, and she had that innocent, "I'm with mommy, so I'm safe" mindset. So, what does she do? She starts chatting away, telling him about the Christmas gift she picked out for her dad, and asking if he knew what Minecraft was. At this point, I'm dying inside. Her enthusiastic chatter is only encouraging him to stick around, and I can't find my keys fast enough to get us out of there. At some point, this sinking feeling of dread hit me like a ton of bricks. What if I lost my keys in the mall? The thought made my stomach drop. Here I was, standing outside with my 2 kids, a strange man who kept glancing over his shoulder, and no way to get into the car. He wasn't leaving. He was just standing there, talking, as if he were waiting for something. And then it hit me. What if he's waiting for the perfect moment to act? The horrifying scenarios started flooding my mind. What if he grabbed one of my girls and used them as leverage? If he threatened their lives, I'd do anything he said, no question. My heart started racing, my stomach doing those nauseating flip-flops, and my adrenaline kicked into overdrive. I felt like any second now, this was going to go south. We were completely alone. No witnesses, no one around to help. In that moment, it felt like all the odds were against us. And then, out of nowhere, he said, "Okay, it was nice talking with you. See you later." Just like that. He casually turned and walked off in the same direction he came from. As soon as he left, my hands finally landed on my car keys, buried in my purse. I unlocked the car, my voice shaking as I told my kids, "Get in, fast." They climbed in, and I jumped in right after, locking the doors as soon as they closed. My hands were trembling as I started the car, and sped out of there like my life depended on it. My 15-year-old, in that classic teenager way, broke the tension by laughing and saying, "Well, that was weird." She brushed it off, joking like it was no big deal. I was flooded with relief, but at the same time, I was so confused. I kept thinking, what the hell just happened? Why would a seemingly normal guy think it was okay to approach a woman and her kids in an empty parking lot at night just to chat? It was bizarre, but since nothing bad had actually happened, I let myself laugh about it too. When we got home, my husband greeted us, asking how shopping went. I said it was fine, but my 15-year-old told him the parking lot story, laughing about how strange it was. I joined in, joking about how I was having a full-blown panic attack while trying to act calm and dig through my purse like nothing was wrong. But then I noticed my husband's face. He went completely pale. His horrified expression stopped me in my tracks, and I quickly tried to reassure him. Look, it was creepy, sure, but the guy was just talking. He eventually left on his own. I didn't think it was a big deal anymore. That's when my husband explained, and what he said shook me to my core. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that the man was likely waiting for me to unlock the car. That's why he stayed so close to us, especially next to the kids. My husband set his position, right by the backseat passenger door, where my 7-year-old was standing. Wasn't a coincidence. His plan was probably to force his way into the car as soon as the doors unlocked. Once inside, he could have pulled a weapon on the kids, knowing I wouldn't abandon them. He'd have leverage to make me cooperate, likely forcing me to drive somewhere remote, and worse. And then my husband dropped another bomb. The fact that the man wasn't wearing a mask. That, he explained, strongly suggested he didn't plan to leave any witnesses. The reality of what could have happened started to sink in, and I felt sick. Then I remembered how long it had taken me to find my keys. My husband said that delay probably spooked the guy. The longer I rummaged in my purse, the more time passed, and the less confident he became. That delay, something that had me panicking in the moment, may have been the reason he decided to walk away. It was like some kind of divine intervention that my keys stayed hidden just long enough to save us. I still get chills thinking about how close we came to a situation that could have ended very, very differently. This rather embarrassing story takes me back to when I was about 19 years old. I'm a guy from Australia, and this happened in the mid-2000s. It was Boxing Day, the day after Christmas for those who might not know, and the local shopping center was buzzing with people chasing the big sales. My wallet was packed with cash, so I hopped in my car and headed to the mall, ready to snag some bargains. But of course, everyone else in town had the same idea. The parking lot was a complete madhouse. Cars were barely moving, and everyone seemed to be circling endlessly looking for a spot. While I was crawling along in the line of traffic, I noticed a man off to my left. He was middle-aged, a little overweight, and oddly dressed for the middle of summer. He was waving in my direction. I ignored him and kept driving, figuring he was someone else's problem. A few minutes later, I looped back around, still no closer to finding a park. And there he was, still standing in the same spot. This time, traffic ahead of me had stopped completely, so I had nowhere to go. That's when he walked over to the passenger side window. Now let me tell you, this guy did not give me a good vibe. He had a shaved head, random tattoos, an unkempt fake leather jacket, and for some reason, gloves. Gloves. in the sweltering Australian summer heat. Looking back, I have no idea why I made the decision I did, but, well, here's what happened. "Hey, mate," he said, leaning towards my window. "Merry Christmas. Reckon you could do me a favor and drive me to Cash Converters?" For context, Cash Converters is a pawn shop, quick loan place, just a couple of streets over from the mall. Now maybe it was the Christmas spirit still lingering in the air, or maybe I thought I could handle myself if anything weird happened. Or honestly, maybe I was just fed up with the parking chaos and welcomed the distraction. Either way, I leaned over, unlocked the door, and said, "Why not?" He climbed in. As we drove off, he started talking. "I just liquidated my business," he said. Apparently, he'd owned an electronics shop. I wasn't buying it, though. His sketchy appearance didn't exactly scream successful businessman. In hindsight, my gut was already telling me this was a mistake. Then he said, "I can sell you a cheap laptop or a DVD player. Gotta get rid of everything. That's why I need to go to Cashies." I tried to play it cool. "Nah, cheers though," I said, as casually as I could. Meanwhile, I noticed something that made me even more uneasy. He hadn't put on his seatbelt. "Come on," he urged. "It'll be brand new. Here's the place." He motioned to a spot ahead, and I reluctantly pulled over near an Asian grocer. The area didn't look like much. Definitely not a place where you'd expect to shop. Still, I stopped the car. "My old shop's behind the grocer," he said. "Hang on, I'll get you something nice." This was the moment I decided I'd had enough. "No," I said firmly, "and I think I'll leave you here." His tone shifted. "What are you saying?" he asked, and I could feel the tension rising. "I'd like you to get out of the car, thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. His demeanor shifted instantly. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, turning his whole body to face me. "No," I replied, suddenly hyper-aware that I was still buckled in. Before I could unclip, he added, "I carry a knife for when cunts like you try to threaten me." That's when my mouth went completely dry. He reached into his pocket, and my heart started pounding. I raised both hands, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. "I'm not threatening you," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the panic rising in my chest. Then he pulled out a knife. It wasn't some fancy switchblade or anything. It was just a regular kitchen knife, but it was big enough to make my blood run cold. "How about you give me whatever cash you've got in your wallet," he said, "and I'll bring you back a laptop like I promised." I realized I had no choice. "You're robbing me," I said quietly, my hands shaking as I reached for my wallet. I had to lift my hips off the seat to fish it out of my back pocket, and all I could think was how easy it would be for him to stab me right then and there. If he wanted to, he could take the car too. "Not robbing you," he insisted, as if that made any difference. He leaned over and plucked the yellow $50 bills straight out of my wallet, pinching them like he was handling dirty laundry. "You'll have a Dell in 2 minutes," he added, tucking the money away. He slipped the knife back into his pocket, opened the car door, and casually strolled into the grocer's shop. As soon as he was out, I locked the doors and grabbed my phone. My hands were still shaking as I dialed 000, the emergency number here in Australia, and explained what had just happened. The operator assured me that the police were nearby, given that the station was just a street over, and they'd be there soon. "I'm going into the shop," I told them. Honestly, I can't remember if they thought that was a good idea or not. I was too rattled to care. I stepped into the grocer and asked the staff if they'd seen a guy matching his description. They They just shook their heads and acted like they didn't understand me. I figured he'd slipped out the back and was long gone. Long story short, he got away. The police showed up about 10 minutes later, and while they were professional, they couldn't help but point out how stupid I'd been to let such a sketchy guy into my car. I gave them my statement back at the station, and that was pretty much the end of it. I'd lost a few $100s for trying to be a well-meaning, but clearly foolish, Samaritan. A couple of weeks later, I got a call from the constable who'd taken my statement. Apparently, some girls had been robbed in the same mall by someone matching the guy's description. He'd sat down at their table in the food court and told them he had a knife under the table, then demanded their money. The constable said they'd call me if they needed me to view footage or come in for anything, but I never heard from them again. The whole ordeal haunted me for a while. I usually pride myself on having pretty good instincts, but that day, I felt like I'd completely failed myself. I didn't even tell anyone about it for a couple of weeks. I was too embarrassed about being such an easy mark. What stuck with me most, though, was the way this guy operated. Somehow, he managed to frame his actions as if I were the threat, and he was doing me a favor by robbing me. I couldn't decide if that bizarre psychological approach was something he actually believed, or if it was just a tactic to keep me off balance. One thing was certain. Even with the Christmas spirit in full swing, I learned to be a lot more careful about who I offered to help after that. For a bit of background, I'm a 22-year-old guy living in a big city in the Midwest. I drive for Lyft to help pay my way through trade school. I also work with a few other similar companies, but that's not important right now. Let's just say I've had my fair share of horror stories while driving, but those will have to wait for another day. This particular incident happened on Christmas Eve in 2020. I was out driving for a few hours before heading to my mom's house to celebrate with my wife and our newborn. It was a pretty standard night, nothing unusual. I got a ride request from a lower-income apartment complex. Nothing out of the ordinary there. When I arrived, I found my passenger right away. He was standing there with all of his belongings, several boxes of stuff. Now, my car is a 2006 Chevy Impala, so space was definitely tight, but we managed to squeeze everything in. Barely. Once we were on our way, he started crying. Through his tears, he explained that he'd just caught his girlfriend cheating on him earlier that night. To make things worse, the apartment was in her name, so he couldn't stay there anymore. He didn't have anywhere else to go, so I was taking him to a motel. Now let me tell you about this motel. It was on a street in my city, infamous for all kinds of shady activity. Hookers, drugs, gangs, weapons, and the sketchiest motels you can imagine. You name it, it's happening on this street. When we arrived, he asked me to wait for him while he went inside to check in and get his room key. "No problem, man," I said. Now, here's where I have a bit of a confession to make. I bend the rules a little when it comes to driving for Lyft. You see, I keep a gun in a concealed holster secured under the driver's seat. I've had it there ever since I started driving because, well, I've had my fair share of close calls. I've had knives pulled on me, people try to rob me, fight me, you name it. It's not something I'd recommend, but it's my way of feeling a little safer out there. Back to the story. This motel was every bit as sketchy as you'd expect for a place on that street. Homeless people were wandering around everywhere. Over in the far corner of the complex, I saw a guy slumped against the wall with a needle still in his arm. The whole vibe of the place was like something straight out of a true crime podcast or a horror story. The guy got his key, and since the motel was all ground level, I offered to drive him to his door to make unloading all his stuff easier. As I mentioned earlier, my passenger had a lot of stuff, so I decided to help him unload. On my second trip back to the car to grab more boxes, something caught my eye. A guy walked out of a room just a bit south of where my car was parked. 2 women followed close behind him. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then they made their way over to the room right next to the one my passenger was moving into. One of the women pounded on the door before opening it. That's when things took a terrifying turn. I saw the guy pull a shotgun out from under his long coat and storm into the room. The 2 women followed him, slamming the door behind them. I froze. My heart started racing as I heard yelling and shouting coming from inside. I was bracing myself, just waiting for the sound of gunfire. Out of nowhere, my passenger came up behind me. "I can take it from here, man," he said calmly. "Go ahead and take off. Have a Merry Christmas." Before I could even process what was happening, he grabbed the boxes out of my hands and slipped a cash tip, a crumpled $5 bill, into my pocket. I didn't even register it at first because I was completely frozen. My mind was spinning, replaying what I'd just seen. I knew what might be going down in that room, and I knew the guy with the shotgun, along with both women, had seen me. Worse, I knew they knew I'd seen the gun. One thought kept running through my head. I have to leave. Now. I bolted back to my car, jumped in, and sped away as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the steering wheel. I drove a block or so before pulling over and calling the cops. I gave them every detail I could remember, what the guy looked like, the 2 women, the room they went into, everything. After hanging up with the police, I logged out of the Lyft app. I hadn't made much money that night, but I didn't care. I was done. Later that night, I got a call from the cops. They told me they'd investigated, but hadn't found the gunman or the 2 women. The people in the room they'd gone into claimed nothing had happened, and even suggested I'd made the whole thing up. The cops didn't find any evidence to back up my story. But I know what I saw. A shotgun doesn't just magically appear in someone's coat and then vanish into thin air. That whole night still sends chills down my spine. His happened in 2005 during Christmas vacation. I had moved away for college and was back home to visit for the holidays. It was nice to be back in my small, snowy hometown, where life felt simple and safe. I spent about a week there, enjoying the familiar sights and catching up with old friends. On my last night in town, a friend and I decided to go sledding. It was 3 a.m. The world was quiet, blanketed in snow, and the idea of a spontaneous late-night adventure seemed perfect. We got into her car and drove to the hill, laughing as we took turns sledding down, enjoying the crisp air and the thrill of the ride. We were standing at the top of the hill, catching our breath, when she got ready to go down again. But something stopped me. "Wait," I said, holding out my hand to stop her. She turned to me, confused. "What's wrong?" I couldn't explain it at first, but something felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a wave of unease washed over me. My chest felt tight, and an inexplicable sense of urgency took over. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I just have a really bad feeling. We need to leave. Now." She hesitated, probably thinking I was being paranoid, but eventually nodded. We packed up quickly and drove back to my family's house. My hometown was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. Crime was virtually non-existent, and everyone knew their neighbors. But as soon as we got home, I felt compelled to check all the locks. "Why are you locking everything?" my friend asked, watching me. "I don't know," I replied, still feeling that strange sense of unease. I checked all the windows too, and found several of them unlocked. It was unusual, but again, I tried to brush it off. My flight back to campus was only 4 hours away, and I was running on adrenaline. I eventually managed to get about 2 hours of restless sleep. When I woke up, I decided to step outside to take in the fresh air and admire the snow one last time before leaving. The world was still and quiet, the kind of peaceful morning I'd always loved. I wandered to the front yard, where a huge pine tree stood, its branches heavy with snow. The way the snow settled on the tree had always looked beautiful to me, like something out of a postcard. But something caught my eye. What should have been a pristine blanket of fresh snow was disrupted by massive footprints. They were unmistakably man-sized and wound around the tree, leading toward the backyard. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the tracks. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my uncle had been out there smoking earlier, or someone else had gone for a walk. I clung to those explanations, trying to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. But the unease from earlier came flooding back, stronger than ever. That same gut-wrenching feeling from the sledding hill came rushing back, the deep anxiety and paranoia churning in the pit of my stomach. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Then I saw him. To my left, a man emerged, running full speed toward me. No, sprinting. He was huge, close to 300 pounds and about 6 feet tall, but for his size, he moved incredibly fast. What struck me even harder than his speed was his focus. His eyes were locked on me, his face twisted with intent. He wasn't out for a morning jog. He was coming for me. I froze, paralyzed with fear as the realization hit me. He wasn't just running, he was chasing. I wanted to move, to get inside, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Panic clawed at me as I fought against the overwhelming fear. Finally, with every ounce of willpower I had, I snapped out of it, turned, and bolted to the front door. I slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and immediately ran to the window. My heart felt like it would explode as I peered outside, desperate to see if he was still there. He was. The man stood on my porch, his hand gripping the doorknob like he was testing it. His chest heaved as he caught his breath. Then he turned his head, and I followed his gaze. Parked in the street was a white van. A second man sat behind the wheel, staring directly at my house. He raised his hands in an impatient gesture, as if to say, "Well, what now?" The runner shook his head and threw his hands up in frustration, signaling something back to the man in the van. With one last glance at my door, he walked off, climbed into the van, and they drove away. I stayed frozen at the window, watching them disappear, my heart still pounding in my chest. It felt like my whole body was shaking. Once I could move again, I ran to wake up my friend. I dragged her out of bed, insisting she help me check every inch of the house. We started walking through the property, and that's when we saw it. The footprints. They weren't just by the front door or the tree. The prints led to every door and every window around the house. He had circled the entire place, testing the entrances. My friend tried to rationalize it, saying maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But I knew better. The look in his eyes as he sprinted toward me wasn't just unsettling. It was malicious. It told me everything I needed to know. If he had caught me, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my parents took me to a Christmas market filled with fun activities for kids. It was supposed to be a magical experience, but in hindsight, I realized my parents were preoccupied with their own issues. They were fighting and distracted the whole time. Because of that, they left me to explore on my own. The market operated on a voucher system. You'd buy vouchers at the entrance, and each one let you participate in an activity. The place was bustling with options: baking cookies, painting, wood burning for the older kids, you name it. I had about 10 vouchers, and each activity took roughly 15 minutes. While I was busy having the time of my life, my parents had settled into a cafe out of sight. Since the event was gated and only open to children and their guardians, I guess they thought it was safe enough to let me roam free. I didn't mind at the time. The freedom was thrilling, and the market was magical. My favorite activity was fabric painting. You got a piece of linen and could decorate it with Christmas patterns and designs. By the time this incident happened, I was already queuing for my third round in the fabric painting section. I didn't care. I loved it. The queue was pretty long, and I was about halfway to the front when I felt someone grab my arm. The touch startled me immediately. My parents had never grabbed me like that, and I didn't know anyone else at the market. Panic surged through me as I turned to see who it was. An older woman, maybe in her 40s or 50s, stood there holding my arm. She was well-dressed, looking strict, but otherwise normal. I didn't recognize her, and her grip was firm, pulling me out of the queue against my will. I yelped and tried to pull away, asking her to let go, but she simply said, "You always do this. Come on, Marie." Marie? That wasn't my name. Not even close. I yelled back, telling her she had the wrong person, but she didn't seem to care. She looked annoyed and said something dismissive about tantrums as she started dragging me away. At first, I thought maybe she had genuinely mistaken me for someone else. I was a pretty average-looking kid, brunette ponytail, plain clothes, but the way she was acting didn't feel right. Then, it hit me. If I didn't escape, she might actually take me away. Desperation kicked in. I opened my mouth and screamed, loud, shrill, piercing. Not words, just a full-on screech. Before that, I'd only been yelling for her to let me go, but now, I was going all out. I didn't care about being polite anymore. The scream startled her. She paused for a moment, but her grip on my forearm didn't loosen. I took a deep breath and yelled the only thing I could think of. "My name is Sam!" This time, people started noticing. Before, they probably assumed I was just a kid throwing a tantrum. But now, they could see the fear on my face. I was clearly too old to not know my own name, and I was visibly terrified. I made eye contact with the first person I saw, a man in his early 30s standing nearby. His face registered confusion and concern as I locked eyes with him and pleaded, "Help me!" To my relief, he started walking toward us. We were almost at the exit. She dragged me quite far, and I guess she decided by then that I wasn't worth the hassle. Abruptly, she let me go. Since I had been fighting her the whole time, I immediately lost my balance and fell hard onto the ground. The fall must have drawn even more attention, because people began stepping forward to help me. I was sobbing uncontrollably, and as soon as I scrambled to my feet, I bolted in the opposite direction, running toward where I knew my parents were. I must have barreled into at least 10 people, adults and kids alike, as I sprinted, desperate to find them. The cafe was in the middle of the market, and I knew exactly where to go. Even through my tears, I could spot my mom easily. Her bright red hair, which was unmistakably fake but always stood out, was like a beacon. In my panic, I slammed into a table near her, knocking things over as I threw myself into her arms. My mom was shocked and understandably upset. She was torn between scolding me for causing such a scene and worrying about what could have happened to leave me in such a state. I was not the kind of kid to make disturbances. I was always polite and well-behaved, so she knew something had to be very wrong. I tried to explain, but I was too hysterical to get the words out. A crowd started to form as people became curious about the commotion. That's when I realized the man I had begged for help had followed me to the cafe. He was talking to my parents, recounting everything he'd seen. He kept asking them if my grandmother was there, or if I could have known the woman who grabbed me. My mom quickly clarified that my grandma wasn't even in the same country. There was no way I could have known her. She turned to me and asked if what he was saying was true. I nodded furiously through my tears as he described how the woman had been dragging me off, calling me Marie. With the man, his teenage son, and my parents, we went straight to security. I tried my best to describe the woman, but I was only a kid and still overwhelmed. My description was vague, but thankfully, the man who helped me gave a much more detailed account of her appearance. Unfortunately, by then, she was long gone. I think security called the police, but I don't remember ever speaking to any officers. As the adults discussed what had happened, I started to feel a little guilty. I noticed the man's son had been with him at the market, and I felt bad for interrupting their day. So I handed him the rest of my vouchers, telling him to use them and enjoy the activities I hadn't gotten to. He was incredibly kind, brushing off my apology and even giving me a pack of cookies he'd baked earlier to cheer me up. For some reason, that small gesture meant the world to me in that moment, more than anything the adults could have done. My parents, of course, took me home immediately. We never went back to that Christmas market again. The next day, there was a short article in the local newspaper about a kidnapping scare. My mom told me years later that it was all speculation, and that no one confirmed whether it was an actual abduction attempt or just a misunderstanding. But I knew the truth. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Not with the way she gripped me. Not with the bruises I had on my arm, where her fingers dug through my sweater. To this day, I still don't enjoy Christmas markets. The memories make me uneasy, and the sight of bustling crowds brings back that panicked feeling. I'll never forget how close I came to being taken, and how grateful I was to those who stepped in to help. This happened in the 90s during Christmas break, when I was around 7 or 8 years old in Miami. For a bit of context, my great-grandmother, Nana, had a second husband who turned out to be an abuser. He targeted his own grandkids, including my father and aunts, for over a decade. It wasn't until after his death, around the time I was born, that the truth came out. Thankfully, I never met him, but the impact of his actions left a deep scar on my family. Because of this, my family became hyper-vigilant about my safety. They set strict rules. I wasn't allowed to play outside alone, and sleepovers were completely off limits. They made it their mission to shield me from anything they perceived as a threat. Nana lived with us my entire life. Before I started school, she was my full-time caretaker, and even once I began school, she watched over me during every summer and holiday break. I adored her. She was a fiery, no-nonsense Southern redhead with a heart of gold. She didn't let anyone push her around, but she had the biggest soft spot for me. That Christmas, I'd just gotten a shiny new pair of rollerblades and couldn't wait to practice. We had a smooth, paved walkway in front of the house that was perfect for skating. Nana sat on the porch with a book, keeping a watchful eye on me as I went back and forth, trying to find my balance. At some point, the house phone rang. This was back when cordless phones weren't a thing, so Nana hesitated. She considered bringing me inside while she answered it, but I begged her to let me stay outside. I was finally getting the hang of skating and didn't want to stop. After a moment of deliberation, she relented. "Stay where I can see you," she said firmly. She left the main door open so she could still see me through the screen door and disappeared inside. The call only took a few minutes, and when she returned, everything was just as she'd left it. She seemed more at ease, seeing nothing had happened, and settled back into her chair with her book. Meanwhile, I started getting more confident and began trying out some simple tricks. After about half an hour, Nana called me to come inside for lunch, but I wasn't ready to stop just yet. I begged her for a little more time, promising I'd come in as soon as she was finished preparing lunch. She stood on the porch for a moment, watching me closely before finally agreeing. "Sing while you skate," she instructed, "so I can hear you." I happily obliged, belting out NSYNC's Digital Get Down as I continued practicing. Everything felt perfectly normal. But then, just a couple of minutes later, I noticed something. A white van was creeping down the street at an unnervingly slow pace. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was just a kid, blissfully unaware of the dangers lurking in the world. Besides, I was behind the chain-link fence that surrounded our yard, and in my young mind, that meant I was safe. But something about the way the van moved made my stomach tighten, even if I didn't fully understand why. Even when the van rolled up and stopped directly in front of our house, I kept skating. I didn't think much of it at first, but that changed when the passenger door opened and an extremely tall man stepped out. He called out, asking me for directions to the highway. Nervously, I held on to the chain-link gate for stability and pointed in the direction I thought it was. His size and presence unsettled me, but I tried to keep my composure. He made small talk I can barely remember, something about how my Christmas was and what Santa had brought me. Then his tone shifted, and he asked if I wanted some toys his daughter didn't want, mentioning a Barbie house. That's when fear began to creep in. I didn't respond. The way he looked at me was unnerving. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and the contrast between his cheerful words and the dark intensity in his gaze made my skin crawl. Slowly, he stepped closer to the gate. He asked again, this time suggesting I come check out the toy. My stomach turned. It was like a scene ripped straight out of the stranger danger lessons I'd been taught at school and at home. I shook my head firmly, skating backward toward the house. I didn't want to take my eyes off him, but I also didn't want to yell or run. I was still clinging to the naive thought that maybe he was just a nice guy, and I didn't want to be rude. He kept coming closer. He was only a few feet from the gate now when he asked, "Are your parents home?" Politeness was the last thing on my mind at that point. Panic took over, and I screamed for my Nana while trying to turn and run inside. But my fear got the better of me. I stumbled, landing hard on my back, and smacked the back of my head against the concrete. At that exact moment, the man unlatched the gate and started coming inside. Before he could reach me, Nana burst through the door like a force of nature, brandishing a cast iron skillet in one hand and cursing loudly enough to shake the neighborhood. The man froze for a split second, then bolted. He jumped back into the van, and before the door was even fully closed, the driver sped off down the street. Nana didn't stop. She bypassed me entirely and ran after the van, shouting and trying to get their license plate number. When she came back, she carried me inside and immediately called the police and my dad while trying to piece together what had happened. 10 minutes later, paramedics were at the house, patching up my scraped elbows, while Nana explained everything to the officers. My dad showed up shortly after, furious and shaken. Needless to say, I didn't step outside for the rest of that holiday break. Years later, when I was a teenager, the memory came up during a family Christmas gathering, and I learned more about what had really happened. Apparently, Nana had been on edge that day for a good reason. Just before Christmas, there had been a report of a man breaking into a woman's apartment in Broward, a nearby city. He had assaulted her and was still on the loose. The description Nana and I gave to the police matched the attacker perfectly. Balding, bright blue eyes, and well over 6 feet tall. We never found out if they caught him, or if he and the van driver had planned something together. But one thing I know for certain: whatever that man had planned for me, my Nana stopped it. Thank God for her.